getting back. Also, just want to let you know we're videoing the session today, and it'll be available through the Unicorn Foundation. If you want to take parts of this back to your agency or your organization, that video will be available. Also, I just wanted to mention to you both on the Interdependence Network website, buildingsocialcapital.org, and on my website, you can see it right above the word micro, alcondalucci.com. We have some short little videos available. We have there are 6-7 minute training videos really designed to get a conversation going about social capital, about what is the real problem here, about social isolation, and there's also a number of monographs on both websites that are chapters from our book or sections from our book. And I did want to mention that, the book Social Capital, The Key to Macro Change, the book that Jeff and I did, came out last year. We have some copies available if anybody is interested. You have a flyer on the books in your packet, but we make the book available at a discount, and know that we don't get royalties on this book, Jeff or I or Jamie, or the stuff we do. The royalties go back to nonprofit organizations. In the case of this book, to our organization CLASS in Pittsburgh, to help us continue to do the work we do. So we want to get the information out to people, but any monies or profits that are generated from these kinds of products go right back into our work. So we also have up here a couple other books that are companions to this book, Social Capital. The book, The Essence of Interdependence, which really frames this shift from micro to macro. We have a book called Together is Better that really looks at the 4 steps of community building. We'll get into that a little bit later. I have a brand new book out that I just did, and it just came out 2 months ago. It's called The Macro Change Handbook. And that book really looks at the formal side of macro change. So how do we change rules? How do we change regulations? We still need to do that, and we still need to know how to do that. So that book is focused on organizing and change. And then the book Social Capital is really focused on this informal side to macro change. How do we facilitate people building relationships, people we support building relationships with other people without disabilities in the greater community? And I can't stress that enough. This idea of people with disabilities just being packaged together, we've got to break that thinking. We've got to really recognize, how do we get, James or Trent connected into typical things as opposed to being siloed into disability things. Now, going to some disability gathering is not, that's not bad. We're not saying that's terrible. We all have to have platforms that we sort of begin to embrace life. But if I just spent all my time just with Italians, just think how boring that would be. You know what I mean? Bad things would happen. But what happens is, I'm comfortable when I'm with my paisans, right? We speak the same language, we have the same history. That's very comfortable. But I don't really grow until I meet you, until I bridge to some other places. And 2 things happen. I grow, and you grow too. So this idea of connecting people to typical things become really the clarion call of this, of what we want to talk about today. We're not about saying, how do we build more sort of services for people with disabilities? There's plenty of services for people with disabilities. What we want to see is, how do people who are experiencing disabilities or other vulnerabilities connect with other people in a more general way and broaden the thinking of the greater community. So in this module, we want to introduce you to social capital and talk a little bit about what we know about it, how it's defined, what it's associated with, some of the studies that have been done on social capital. Jeff and I are going to kind of go through this. A lot of this stuff we cover in the book. We highlight programs like Jamie's in this book, in terms of illustrating examples of how organizations can really broaden their reach in terms of social capital. So, Jeff, if we could just get that first slide.
And we will be emailing, did you mention that? We will be emailing all these slides to everyone afterwards. We just really want everyone to pay attention and to engage. So don't worry about taking copious notes. You will get all of this afterwards.
Yeah. Okay.
I know, I'm like that.
And so here's the definition of social capital. It was first coined in 1914 by an educator, our educators in the room, by the name of L.F. Hanifin. And Hanifin, who taught in Chicago, began to sort of see that his kids that were connected did better than the kids that were isolated. And we still know that that's true today. Kids who are connected do better. They do better on test scores. They do better on the soft skills that are necessary to engage successfully in life. And so he coined the term social capital, but used that as a phrase primarily to raise attention and make it more serious. Because if you just call it friendships, people sort of diss it. Friendships, yeah, I mean, yeah. Even relationships, yeah, relationship, yeah. But social capital really causes people to begin to think, what is that? And how, what does that mean? So it's sort of an attention-raising sort of phrase. But it illustrates that our social connections are valuable to us. They're actually save us money. They're just like getting money from somebody or something. So this idea of capital gets the attention of people. And that's why Hanifin began to use the phrase social capital. You know who wrote about this, though, without defining it, was Tocqueville, Alexis Tocqueville, who came to the United States in 1852 to study what was making America great. And America at that time was really beginning to, just skyrocket in terms of what we were doing as a country, making all these other European countries kind of in our dust. And Tocqueville came to the United States with this sort of intention of trying to find what made America great. And so he went all around the country and in villages and towns and met with people and discovered the secret to America's success was what he called habits of the heart. How people in America came together, worked together, cooperated, collaborated to solve problems. And that in feudal Europe, that wasn't happening. What was expected was, the kings and the royalty, they would, make the decisions and they solved the problems and it would trickle down. But in the United States, it was exactly the opposite. It was these habits of the heart. Tocqueville wrote about this in his famous book, Democracy in America, which you probably had to read when you were a freshman in college and forgot totally, or got the Cliff's Notes and just sort of breezed by that. But there's a long history. In fact, you can actually take social capital back to the writings of Cicero and Aristotle and the Greek scholars, even in the I Ching from Asian cultures. The great Chinese writings talked about relationships and how important they are and how valuable they are. So social capital refers to not just the relationships, but the value we get from those relationships. Jeff, next slide, please. Now, the construct of social capital is framed off the philosophy of interdependence. Now, there are three paradigms that are a part of our sort of framework in our lives. The first paradigm is the paradigm of dependence. When babies are born, they're the most dependent creatures on the planet. Without an adult or without a parent, a human baby will die. They will not survive. So the paradigm of dependence is how we're all born into life. As we start getting older, we move into what's called the paradigm of independence, right? And any of us raising teenagers know that when kids get to that level, they begin to think they know it all, or they have all the answers. They don't need to hear from us in terms of guidance. They have it all figured out. But in reality, nobody is fully independent. Everybody in this room has dependencies we're always going to have in our lives. And as we get older, those dependencies will grow. So dependencies and independencies are sort of this balance. And when we move to the paradigm of interdependence, we begin to understand that. So dependence is the paradigm of you. I need you. I can't function without you. Independence is the paradigm of me. Get out of my way. I can do it all. Interdependence is the paradigm of we. It's a synergistic, collaborative, connectable paradigm about how we need each other, how our lives are only successful through each other. None of us are successful by ourselves. Nobody is. If you're a successful person, however you might measure that, it's because of all these people around you who loved you, cared for you, propped you up, kicked you in the butt when you needed it, supported you in your voyage. And you reciprocated. You also supported them. That's interdependence. That's the philosophy that undergirds this. And, and I mentioned the book, my first book, which came out in 1990 called Interdependence, the Route to Community. This book is a further look at this construct of interdependence. It's called The Essence of Interdependence. And it really gets more into this philosophy, talks about it in terms of how we can utilize it in our work. Next slide, Jeff. So to think about this phenomena of social capital, I want to present to you a very simple, next slide, a magic wand question. This is a question sociologists have used around the world to try to ferret out what are the most important quality of life variables. Like, what's the most important thing in life? And, just using this kind of question as a springboard to answering what is the most important thing in life. So if you had the magic wand and you could wish for 3 things for people you love or care about, what would you wish for? Maybe a better way to even think about it is if you were, take your first baby that you had, and how important that experience was to you, and just think about what you were hoping for or wishing for that little baby when you looked into her eyes when you first met her, right? And when people sort of think in that kind of sober way, Jeff, the next slide, the top 3 answers to that question are always surround these 3 elements. Health. Health is always number 1, right? And I remember, I have 3 children, and I remember every call from the hospital with each of the 3 kids to Condoleezza Hill to announce the baby. And the very first question that I was asked by every relative I called was, is the baby healthy? Is Liz healthy? Is everybody okay? And that's always preeminent. And if any of you have ever had a health scare, you know that you can't think of anything else. You're almost like paralyzed by it. Health is absolutely, fundamentally, the most important quality of life variable in our society. And that's why healthcare should never be a political football. Healthcare should be available universally. We shouldn't have to beg for it. We shouldn't have to get on our knees. We shouldn't have to deal with the politics around it. It's so essential to our well-being. Nothing else happens after it, right? So it's fundamental. But then second is happiness. I remember looking into my daughter's eyes, right, and just thinking, I hope that she has a happy life. And I hope that she smiles more than cries. In fact, to this day, she knows that if she cries, I melt, right? And she plays me like a violin with that. We'll be out there, I run and buy her something, to try to make it better. But in fact, it really goes back to this primal notion of happiness. We just want our children to be happy, right? That we want them to be celebrated. Happiness is powerful. And then longevity. The greatest tragedy that can befall a person is to have to bury a child. It just goes out of what's considered part of the natural flow of life, that children bury parents. Parents don't bury children, right? It's adverse. It's paradoxical. So this notion of longevity, helping that your baby lives a good long life. And also we know that this is in order, because lots of times if somebody's health is being compromised or somebody's not happy, they sometimes don't want to live. I mean, California has just passed, the same law that we have in Oregon that really allow people who are in a terminal situation to end the life the way they want to end it. But that notion of suicide data suggests that unhappiness is always a variable in somebody taking their own life. And so these three things are critical. But what is even more powerful, Jeff, next slide, is that research shows that these three things, health, happiness, and longevity, are all related to social capital. I mean, just quite simply, the more relationships you have in your life, the healthier you are, the happier you are, and in fact, the longer you live. And data is very, very clear on this. There's no refuting this. And there's scientific evidence for it, actually. In health, we know that what is a precursor to people getting sick is stress. And we know when stress goes up, immunities go down. But relationships bring stress down because the more relationships we have, the more people we have watching our back, or that we can call on, or that we can reciprocate with, or we can connect to. And that brings our stress down. As our stress goes down, our immunity system actually goes up. At the University of Pittsburgh, and all the fine universities around the world, know that when our freshmen come to campus in the fall, and we usually bring at University of Pittsburgh, we bring in 10,000 freshmen. So they're coming in from all over the world, and they're leaving their social capital for the first time, most of them. And as they leave their social capital networks and come to a brand new place where they don't know anybody, where they're nervous and worried, their stress levels go up, and then we see our health clinic visits spike, right? And in August, September, October, these kids get sick, mostly because they're away from their social capital network. What keeps you healthy is not hospitals or medicine. What keeps you healthy are friends who encourage you to go to see the doc, who bring you chicken soup when you're sick, who go get a prescription for you. The people in your life keep you healthy. And that is now there's no even argument about that. We also know that relationships are seminal to happiness. If something good happens to you and it makes you happy, I don't know, you got a promotion, you're getting a new job, you're going to have a baby, you're going to do this, or whatever it might be, getting married, you find a new lover, or whatever. You can't wait to tell people about that. You just can't wait to share your happiness with people that you know. And so the data and the evidence is clear. Last, we know that people will live longer if they're connected and relevant. Relevance becomes important here. Just being connected is not enough. You have to be relevant too. But people, elders who are connected and relevant in those roles live longer than elders that get sort of put out to pasture or admitted into a nursing home or some long-term care facility and become irrelevant. So the notion of people's relationships and relevance literally sustain life. The longitudinal studies are clear. Jeff? So the more social capital you have, the healthier you are, the happier you are, and the longer you live. But there's more. It's almost like you remember the Ginsu knife commercials?
Wait.
Yeah, but wait. Yeah, I mean, you're in the middle of the night, you just got home from the bar, and a credit card and alcohol are a bad mix, and some Ginsu knife commercial comes on, and you say, man, they're cutting through pipes, and I said, man, I could use a couple of those Ginsu knives, and you ordered like 3 dozen of them. But there is more to this notion of social capital. Jeff, we know that social capital is related to these are called pro-social behaviors, these notions. We want to live in a society, in a family, in a culture. We want to attend religious communities that have these things, right? When these things exist, people are celebrated, people are respected, people are included. These are the fundamental elements to inclusion. And they're called pro-social behaviors. and they're related to social capital. Quite simply, you treat people in your life that you know this way, and people that you don't sometimes treat as nice. And, stop and think about it. You're going through McDonald's, and you order, your sandwich. You get up to the window. The kid tells you what you need. You give him a 50 because you don't have any other smaller bills. The kid gives you back too much change. Gives you $20 more than you should get. You're in the horns of an ethical dilemma. Do you tell or don't you? And you might even rationalize it and say, well, I've been eating this crap for years. They owe me. This could be for my stint fund or whatever, right? You'll rationalize it some way or another and drive on. But if you come up to that window and it's your nephew, Johnny, and he gives you $20 too much, you say, Johnny, you gave me 20 too much, honey. You can't do that. The register's going to be missing, and they're going to take it out of your pay or something. So take this 20 back, and next time be more careful, right? So that notion of what causes people to behave more like this is when you know the person. So my cousin Carrie, if she's separated and segregated and insulated from the world, then sometimes the world doesn't treat her this way. And those kids, when we were kids, those kids that made fun of Carrie, that were teased her, that taunted her, that played tricks on her, they didn't treat her this way. Those kids did that because they didn't know her. She didn't go to school. She wasn't a part of the culture. She wasn't a part of the community. She was adjunct. She was sort of separated. And as long as people stay separated, they will be treated adversely. If we want our sons and daughters treated this way, then they've got to be known, right? They've got to start to have these connections. Next slide, Jeff. But we also know not only are pro-social behaviors enhanced by social capital, but we know lots of other really important things. We talked about this earlier during the introductions, that we know that people get jobs and keep jobs, not based on their resume or how cool they're dressed. They get jobs and keep jobs based on their ability to relate and to connect with people. That we know that people will come around the community. If you don't have a car, if you don't have access to a vehicle, or if you have a disability that gets in the way of your driving, but if you have a lot of social capital, you still have now access to things in the community in terms of transportation based on those relationships. Families know this. If your son or daughter can't get a license for whatever reason, either and the license is really the key to connections, because lots of times once you get your license, this becomes now your springboard to other people. You can drive, meet your buddies, go to a show, do this, do that. So getting to the community becomes a critical variable that we have to think about. And for a lot of folks, like my cousin Carrie, she couldn't get a license. And most people with disabilities don't have jobs, so they can't afford to buy a vehicle that somebody could drive them around in. So then it falls on the families. So you moms and dads know that you become the transportation. Now, if family won't do it, then what about public transportation? And we're seeing public transportation being cut back. Many communities don't have adequate public transportation for anybody, let alone for someone who is vulnerable. So people become isolated because they can't get out. They can't become a part of community. Social capital provides a stepstone for people getting out, finding places to live and people to live with. I mean, stop and think about this. Every one of us in this room live with people we've chosen to live with. It may not feel that way this many years later. You might feel like you were sentenced. But in fact, you made a choice, right, about somebody in your social capital network that you wanted to actually spend more time with, to live with, to be with. And that notion of choice in who we live with is oftentimes precluded for people with disabilities. Lots of times people with disabilities have no say in this matter. It's like a slot opens up in a group home and that becomes the answer. I mean, that is just totally inappropriate. People should make choice about who they want to spend their time with and be with. And so as a part of this sort of thinking, the more relationships you have, the more opportunities open up to you. Let me just move on. I could talk about that notion all day, but the psychological stability that we all get in life is really tied to the people in our lives, and that notion of people being there for us, having our backs, watching out for us, become a key element with social capital. Yeah. So, social capital is nothing more than relationships in our lives. And we want to show it to you like this because we're gonna get into this a little bit more. But earlier today when we started, I mentioned to you that the average person has about 150 relationships in their lives, right? And that, by the way, is really predicated on some pretty focused theory. In fact, there's a book called The Theory of 150, written by an anthropologist by the name of Robin Dunbar, that really talks about our limbic brain capacity to know people, and that we are sort of limited to about not limited, we go beyond what our limbic brain sort of can digest. We do that in many ways, but the limbic brain capacity is about 150. That goes back to our tribal nature. When we were in little tribes, when we were first evolving as a species, that 150 became sort of like our world. But it looks a little bit like this. And this is called the sociogram. And in our books and through the Interdependence Network, we have material on sociograms and how they look and how they operate. But a sociogram sort of looks like this. That for each of us, whoever the target person is, there are 3 layers of social capital, right? There are 3 layers. The first layer is what we call the zone, this zone of acquaintanceship. So these people furthest from me at the center are people that I'm acquainted with. I know their name, they know my name. And today we introduced each other, so you now are acquainted with people that you may not have met before, right? And we get acquainted in a lot of different ways, parties, and friends will connect us with other people. So this is the zone of acquaintanceship. You can almost put a zone out here which is sort of like a connector zone, but just in terms of the beginning to think about the relationships in your social capital network, this outermost zone is the zone of acquaintanceship. Moving in closer to the target is the zone of engagement. So these are people that I actually do things with. And then in here is the zone of covenancy. These are people that I love and trust, right? Smaller circle. So quantity, quality, right? Now, the way this makes sense strategically, and we'll examine this a little bit more in some of our conversation later, is that for each of us, you could think about this like a pie with slices of the pie. And each slice represents a community that you belong to and you engage with on a regular basis. So let's start with our most important community and our most initial community in our lives, our family, right? So in your family, if you were the target person, there are people in your family that you're acquainted with, obviously. There are some people in your family you actually engage with, maybe do things. And then there are some members of your family that you really love and trust. Right? So this platform would be your neighbors, your neighborhood. There are people in your neighborhood that you know. People in fact, last evening we went to Jeff's place for some hors d'oeuvres and some beer. And we were sort of just hanging out, and Jeff just moved into a new neighborhood, and we were standing outside, and people were coming by, and they were waving to Jeff and Ann, and they were saying hello, and already in just a year and a half that Jeff has been in this neighborhood, he's got to meet his neighbors. He knows the people beside him and around him. So Jeff is acquainted. there are some people in his neighborhood now that he's beginning to engage with. Block parties, watching out for each other. Maybe, in the morning, Ann might walk with some of the other folks, some of the other men and women in the community want to get their morning walk in. And then there are people in the neighborhood that you trust, right? That you give the key to your house if you want to have your plants watered when you're on vacation, or a package is coming and you don't want to have it leave it outside. So you ask a neighbor, would you just move that package into my house? You give them the key to your house because you trust them, right? So this is a zone of trust. This is a zone of just, interest. We have the same interest. And this is just knowing people in that general community. So you have your family, you have your neighborhood. Some of you might have church or a synagogue community. Some of you certainly have a work community, places where you work. Some of you are members of clubs, groups, and associations. I'm in a golf league. I'm a member of the Pittsburgh Jazz Society, right? So in those venues, I know people. I engage with some of them in activities, and some of them I really like. I really trust. I really feel a connection to them, right? So these very first relationships are called bridging relationships. Sociologists talk about bridging social capital. So I get to meet James today. So we now have a bridge. And as James and I, if we find that we have similarity of interest, so we obviously have one similarity here today. All of us have one similarity here today. That's what got us to this community today. Similarity. We all are interested in seeing people included, welcomed, respected, and valued in community. That's why you came today, right? So that's a similarity that bonds all of us, whether we're from Pittsburgh or from New York or from South Florida. So that we have that similarity. But the other ingredient that makes those slices in the pie are regularity. So seeing each other again and again and again begin to move a relationship from out here to in here, right? So similarity and regularity as combined, sociologically combined, begin to create a bond, right? The first is a bridge. Similarity creates the bridge. And then more and more regularity and finding we have more and more similarity when we're together. We talk about other things. We begin to discover you like jazz music too, and so do I. And you like the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know you guys do. So do I. So those similarities and seeing each other again and again and again begin to create a bond in our relationship. They strengthen our relationships. Those two things. They strengthen any relationship. Right? So this notion of people in your life amounts to, according to Dunbar and some other theorists, about 150 people spread around here. Right? Now, some people have way more. And when you begin to add virtual community, right? Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, other platforms that we engage in, you begin to see this sort of exponential sort of notion of community. And when you go on Twitter, and I know you are not Twitter, when you go on your Facebook page, and I know you did this when we took the break. I know you were kind of scrolling through, seeing who liked your latest picture of your pumpkin pie that you made last night. The notion is you're actually engaging with people. This is a kind of a frame of engagement. So this idea of virtual social capital is also a part of the mix. And, in the work that we do at the Interdependence Network, we're really talking about how do we harness this for building an inclusive society? How do we use not just the relationships that we have, the actual tangible relationships, but how do we actually virtually broaden? So, Jeff and Jamie and I have been doing a lot of blogging, have been doing a lot of, posting of information. In fact, for some of you guys, you might want to take pictures of some of this and post some of this up on your Facebook page. Just saying, hey, we're at this really interesting conversation about social capital. And I really hadn't thought about how important relationships are. Have you? You know, just begin to get people just to start to think about things like that. We can all do those kinds of things. But what I'd like to do just right now with you as a quick exercise on this is I want you to think about this zone in your life. Right? You have all these different platforms. You know what they are. I mean, these guys they have the school, the unicorn school, right? So they have their neighborhood, they have their family, maybe church, maybe, some people maybe work. So you have these in your life. What I want you to do right now is just take a minute, and I want you to reflect on the most important people in your life in those zones. Start with your family, and I just want you to write down their initials. You don't have to write their name. Just on a sheet of paper, I want you to just write down their initials. So in your family, who's really important to you? I mean, if they left your life, you would be seriously wounded by their leaving. And just identify them. Hopefully your husband's on there. Maybe not, I'm not sure. But whoever is in, your kids. Don't feel bad if you don't put your brother on. Because it might be that, you don't have that tight of a relationship with him, and that's okay. Don't feel bad about that. You're not going to share this with anybody. I want you to just start thinking about this most important bonded relationships. So you start with your family, and you have a fair amount of folks, right? And then go into your neighborhood. Just think about who in your neighborhood do you really trust? Maybe no one. Maybe you just moved in and you don't know. Maybe you're in some apartment complex and you don't even want to know your neighbors. That's okay too. But Robert Putnam, the foremost authority on social capital, talks a lot about neighborliness and how important neighbor sort of relationships are. He spends a lot of time on that in his research. But just in your, think about neighbors that you really could count on. And then move into, if you're a regular in your spiritual community, think about people there that would really be, important to you. And maybe no one's there, and that's okay. And then move on to work. So people that you maybe work with that really are important to you. You can trust them. They pick up your check for you. That they'll bring it to you. You can count on them. They're important relationships. They have more depth. And then think about if you're in any club, group, or association. Like I'm in this golf league. There are two guys in the golf league that I really resonate with. I really like these guys. I know I can count on them. I hope they can count on me, which is the reciprocity piece. But just think about the names of people now. These should pop up. You shouldn't have to dig real deep in your thinking. These are places you go on a regular basis and those people that are important to you. Okay? So now what I'd like you to do is count up the number of names that you have identified. We're doing this real quick, but I just want to illustrate a point with you. So just count them up. And what we know about this zone is that it ranges, the numbers of people in this zone range from 5 to 40. From 5 to 40. Now there's some evidence that if you have less than 5, that really is a vulnerable, notion of isolation. That really begins. 5 becomes sort of like a tipping point. 5 or more. If you have less than 5 identified in that really important zone, then that really shows some social isolation. Huh? When my daughter moved, she moved from Pittsburgh to Orlando. So she teaches in Orlando. She and her husband moved. And she's really, just new. They just bought a house and they're in a new neighborhood. And she's trying to, when I sat down with her and we talked a little bit about who was really important to her, obviously family, but we're in Pittsburgh. Her in-laws are in Philly. And so like, who's important to you in your world now? It was, so I said, we gotta get you some social capital, Gianna. You gotta reach out and get you connected a bit more. Because under 5 really suggests some vulnerability. And now, the average is about 18 when people do this.
You mean in every zone?
Every zone.
You should have at least 5 in every zone.
No. We're talking total here. This is total. Yeah, sorry about that, Beth. I make you nervous. Yeah. We're talking about total of 5. 5 or more. And the average in all these different platforms is about 18. It's about 18. And this notion, is that the stronger that zone, the more you reap the benefits, the value of social capital. Okay? So this is kind of an introduction to that. Jeff, next slide, please. So in the bottom line is that the key here is the resources available to you through your relationships. Next slide. This is a quote from Robert Putnam. I mentioned Putnam a couple times, right? And Putnam's at Harvard, and an eminent sociologist, an endowed chair, and probably the most prolific researcher on social capital in America today. And he's kind of world renowned with this. His big book is called Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone. And what Putnam examines in that book is the decline of social capital. And he looks at data over a 100-year period of people joining things. And what he discovered was that these data they increased every decade from 1900 to 1960. And then in 1960, a curious thing happened. We started to see a decline in joining, in connecting, in becoming members. And the reason he used the title Bowling Alone is that in 1960, he discovered through data that close to 100 million people went bowling. And out of that number of people, 80% were in bowling leagues, right? Bowling leagues, 80%. When he went back to that very same date, he discovered that there were more people bowling, but only 20% were bowling in leagues. And so his title, Bowling Alone, more people are bowling, but they're bowling alone. They're not bowling in the presence and in the camaraderie of a league, where you're regular and you meet people and you talk about things and you kind of kick things around. And bowling almost becomes secondary to your conversations and to your connectedness. And so he studies this decline, and he takes a deep look at why we've declined. And actually in his more recent stuff, he's, even in the decades that followed, the declines continued. And so he has a prescription for he's worried about this by virtue of civic engagement decline, democracy being literally weakened as people drop out, bail out, or don't engage as much as they did in the past. So it's a very provocative book, but he says, in the book Bowling Alone, if you belong to no group or community, that is, you don't have, a slice of the pie, and you decide to join just one, you cut your risk of dying in half over the next year, statistically. And this is a powerful, powerful quote, because what it really says is just one place where you become regular, you get to know people, literally, it cuts your risk of dying in half. Right? The other thing that Putnam says in the book Bowling Alone is that as many Americans die from social isolation as from all smoke-related conditions and diseases annually. Well, let me say that again. Because when I read that, I just couldn't believe it. I had to go to the literature to really look at his evidence. But as many people die from social isolation in America today. I'm not talking about people with disabilities. I'm just talking about Americans that are socially isolated. As many die from social isolation as die from all smoke-related diseases and conditions annually. And And we have this big concern about trying to stop people from smoking, when in fact, the bigger issue should be how do we help people join things and become known and get connected? Because those things are really going to be more important than actually smoke cessation in terms of people's survival. So it's very, very powerful and provocative. Next slide, Jeff. So we talked about these 3 rings, right, that we put in that little drawing. The zone of acquaintanceship, people that we know, friendships, the zone of engagement, and covenancies, people that we love. So bonding social capital is really discovered in these deeper relationships. Next slide, Jeff. Bridging social capital is the very first social capital we get when we connect for the first time. We're bridged to another person. We have some similarity that gets us to that point. And then in that initial introduction, we begin to fish for other things that we find in similar. So I'll come to do talks like this, and people will come up to me and say, "Oh, you're from Pittsburgh." I say, "Yeah." "Do you know the Johnson family?" I mean, again, that's what we do. We try to fish for what do we have in common. You know, where is our connection point? And that notion that if I see you again and again and again, and we discover we have more and more in common, then our relationship starts to strengthen. Okay, next slide. So in terms of measuring social capital, you know, some of the work the Interdependence Network has done is really not only social maps, but engagement surveys. Putnam developed an engagement survey out of Harvard back in 2000. And we took, Jamie and Jeff and I, took that survey and we utilized it with 250 people with disabilities in Canada, US, and Australia. And we did the survey, and the survey basically, it wasn't a sociogram, it was a survey just asking people about their patterns of engagement. Where did they go? Who do they go with? How do they spend their time? And the disparity that we found, and the paper that we published is on our website, buildingsocialcapital.org, was incredibly stark in terms of people's isolation and disconnection. Jamie, I don't know if you wanted to just say a word about one or two of the variables, the one about people going out and the thing about the staff piece.
Okay. Our Adult Social Club?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, just the idea that we know people who have disabilities, people that we support are socially isolated. And in Mississauga, we had a big problem in that we've known this for a long time, and we tried lots of different things to try to get people connected. And it was back when I first started, it was probably 20 years ago, they started an adult social club. So the premise of this club was to support people to come out and meet other people who have a like interest, and then they'd go and just hang out and do things. It wasn't great. It was a program that was segregated. It included only people who had disabilities. But at the time, it was kind of the best thing that we had. This turned out to be a huge success. Before 2 or 3 years had passed, it turned into groups of 30, 40, 50 people hanging out together. The club was designed to be a part of the community, so we wouldn't have a room to go to, we wouldn't have an actual club to go to, we just meet at different community venues. People who participated in the club decided what they were going to do and where they were going to go. They designed the schedule, it was on a Wednesday night. But it grew so quickly that we'd actually separate into 2 groups. But you picture, the night is, we're going to go for wings at an Irish club. And 50 people who have disability descend on this club. It's not an integrated option anymore. It's segregated. The group is seen as one. So this was no longer in line with the values of our association, and it wasn't meeting the needs that we had envisioned. But if we were to take that away without replacing it with something else, people would have a big problem with that. We did change it about 3 years ago. We came up with this, the community involvement resource initiative. So what we had done was, and the best part about the club was that people who were there formed groups naturally. So when you go into that big group of 50, if you didn't know them, you saw a big group of people. If you were there regularly, there was small groups of 3 or 4 people that went there and hung out on their own already. and they interacted with each other. They didn't need the club to spend time together. But because we offered it, people came. So we went out, and it was actually the team that I managed, we interviewed every single participant. We determined what their interests were, who the people they already knew at the club were, things that they wanted to do, goals they had for the future, and after those 60, 70 different interviews, we were able to kind of help those people connect with people they already knew and go out and do things on their own. So we were able to kind of shut that club down so it wasn't in line with our values and support people to make connections in the community. So now we'll have a group of, there's four young men who like to play video games or go to movies. But if the club had decided that night they were going to play pool, or they're going to go have a coffee, or go out to a bar and watch some live music, they would tag along because that's what the club was doing. Now they'll just set up their own schedule and their own things to do. And we've had a number of examples of people who, if a young group of ladies who wanted to join a fitness class and take yoga, where they've joined a yoga club, and now they're just a part of the club. There's 3 ladies, they go together, but they're meeting other people in the club. So it's a way to kind of, if you can start with your values first, and make sure that everything you do is in line with your values, everything else kind of falls into place. But it's really easy to get off track, and we found that.
We default so quickly to the siloed sort of reality. Jeff, next slide, please. So there are some natural clusters of connections, natural communities, if you will. And the definition of community is it's a network of different people who come together regularly for something in common. That's how you define community. A network of different people who come together regularly for something in common. So difference is natural in every community that you're a member of. Difference is a natural phenomenon. Now, sociologically, we know that difference can put up some barriers, right? If you walk into a community for the first time, you see a lot of people who are different from you, you'll hesitate. And it's a defense mechanism, basically, we were coded with so that we would make sure that we could survive. That if we didn't understand something, we paused to try to wait until we did understand it before we proceeded. So difference is natural in community. In fact, think about your family right now and all the different members of your family. I bet you there are some weird members of your family. Maybe not you, but I mean just different in maybe attitude, or different in personality, or different in perspective, maybe even just different in appearance, or difference in style. So difference is natural in every community, but difference can create a barrier. What mitigates that barrier is similarity and regularity. I mean, just regularity alone lessens barriers. Think about, in your experience, when you, maybe the first time, well, I mean, even your son or daughter, and the difference that they bring to your family, and how that difference might have caused a pause with your brothers and sisters and relatives. But then, just the fact that you kept on coming with your daughter, you kept on coming, the family members began to, it wasn't as big of a deal. Maybe the first time there was a meltdown, everybody hesitated, but then second time, third time became not as big of a deal. That's just the power of regularity. Just regularity alone has this incredible ingredient to get us over the barrier of difference. But similarity does that as well. The more I find that I have in common with somebody who's different from me, the less their difference matters to me. So sociologically, when we think about relationship building, we know that our son or our daughter or the person that we're concerned about has a difference. And we sometimes think, well, they're better off with their own kind. But that's failed logic for 2 reasons. They're not better off with their own kind. They're better off in our regular community because they make the community better. They make the community a better place. So the seduction of wanting to sort of keep our our kids in segregated silos, we've got to challenge that. We've got to find these bridges back to other people. Jeff, next, and here's some of those clusters of connection. Next slide, please. Let's pass this one over. So, in order to build social capital, you must at least become initially connected to the community. You're not going to build social capital if you're not there. So you got to cross over the bridge. And sometimes that's scary to cross over that bridge. And sometimes you're worried about what might happen on the other side. Will I be liked? Will they make fun of my kid? What's going to happen over there? That's scary. But we got to cross over that bridge. A parallel example is in civil rights, right? Because in some ways, this is a lot of what we're talking about really parallels that notion of people becoming a part of something who have been denied something. And in our country, we know the Jim Crow laws and we know the segregation history of our country, that separation of people just by race, that had to be mitigated. And the symbolic crossing of the bridge, happened in Selma when John Lewis and Dr. King and the other they walked across there. They knew when they got to the other side they were going to get beat. They knew that there was going to be problems on the other side, but they had to cross that bridge. I mean, it was symbolic about kind of getting back. This is part of us too. We are part of this too. And so we as family members and as advocates have got to understand that I know it's not easy, but it absolutely is essential, because if we just stay on the other side of the bridge in our little worlds, in a way, everybody loses in that deal. Everybody. Our sons and daughters, people with disabilities, and mostly the rest of the community on the other side of that bridge, they lose too when they don't get to know your son or daughter or my cousin Carrie or my dad with his Parkinson's situation. They're the losers. So this macro idea, really, it's challenging. It's hard. It's going to be hard for us to do this, but it absolutely is essential, because keeping people on the other side of the bridge really hasn't worked. People don't have what they need, what in their heart they need. Next slide. So, in the work that we've done, Jeff and Jamie and I, we've really identified 4 steps to building relationships. 4 steps. And these are universal. These aren't just disability strategies. This is exactly how I coached my daughter when she moved to Orlando to begin to build friends. This is what I would do if I moved to South Florida. This is what Jeff did when he moved from Pittsburgh to South Florida to build relationships. First off, what are you interested in? So with James and Trent, who are with us today, okay? So we started with James. James, you weren't paying attention. I had to get your attention. So if we would just start with them and say, here's 2 vibrant young men, right? I mean, these guys and what they have to offer the world is unbelievable, right? So who are these men and what are they really interested in? What do they like? What do they care about? Trent, what do you really like? Cars. Okay, very cool. Yeah. Oh, there they are, right? The DuPont registry. My son Santino gets the DuPont registry. And you and Santino could have some great conversations about cars, right? James, what's one of the things you really like? Basketball. What else? Football. Sportsman. Sports enthusiast.
Yeah.
Right? Jamie, hockey. Jamie's a hockey guy. So all of us we could sit down and identify these things in our life. These are the positives. Now, what happens in a micro model is we identify the negatives. What's Carrie Condalusi's problems? What does she struggle with? What is she not good at? This is an asset-based approach, saying, who is Trent? Who is James? What do these guys like? What do they really care about? Right? So we harvest that information. It's called the cultural profile. It's a conversation. We had just a quick one, but if I was sitting with these guys and we begin to talk, we'd talk more about cars and we'd begin to look at other things that Trent likes, other things that James likes beyond basketball and football, because these guys have lots of uniqueness as people in terms of what they're interested in, just like you and I do. Right? There's no difference there. Right? So we start with what do people like, and then the second step is really generic. What's in the community? Where do people who like cars gather on a regular basis? Remember, we're looking for a new slice of the pie for Trent, a slice of the pie. For James, where do people gather who like sports? Right? And we could begin to analyze that. In fact, there's lots of different ways you can find things in your community. You could do a meetup search. You could do a Google search. You could just look at the supermarket where people post things. There's all kinds of different ways we can discover what's out there in the generic community rather than create a segregated community. We don't want Trent in a Williams syndrome car club. We want Trent in a car club where other people go because there's nothing magical about his Williams syndrome. It's just one feature of who this man is. There's all kinds of other things about him, right? So the notion of finding a matching community where people celebrate the interest, they're together based on an interest. And so there's a lot of diversity in the people who go to these places, and that's a good thing, both for Trent as well as for the other members of that gathering. Then the third step, and this is a strategy, how do people behave in that car club or in the camera club or at the sports bar or whatever the venue is that we found? How do people behave? What's expected of them? This is an anthropological step. Because when people come regular, they come again and again and again, they begin to forge rituals, patterns, they form words, it's called jargon. These are anthropological features. Let me give an example. When I was a little boy, 6, 7 years old, my dad took me to church for the first time. Church was really important to my dad, right? And he went all the time, he and my mom. And so my dad took me, and we walked up these big steps. And there was a little bowl of water in the doorway, right? And my dad called it holy water. I said, Daddy, there's no holes in that water. Holy water. Didn't understand it. Still don't really understand it. My dad said, son, take 3 fingers like this. He actually showed me the ritual. 3 fingers, keep them together like that. Never use one finger. Never ever this finger. You keep these fingers together like that, and you dip the fingertips in the holy water, right? So my dad showed me, he did it, and he said, take your wet fingers and bring them up to your forehead. Say in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. We don't say ghost anymore, we say spirit. Catholics are hip. We got Pope Francis on our side. We used to say ghost, and for me that was a trigger word, ghost. I said, Daddy, there are ghosts in here. In this big room, right? And my dad said, yeah. He said, but they're nice ghosts, right? But those are all elements of what's expected in a community, right? So when I do this, and everybody else is doing this, that's another similarity. Remember, similarities connect, they attract. When people do the same thing, they announce that they're a member of the tribe when they do this in that little tribe. Right? So that notion of what's expected, every community has these. And we've got to sort of figure out what they are, maybe even a little coaching, maybe even a little kind of conversation about it. Maybe we even practice a little bit, maybe a little role play, right? However we might want to do that to prepare Trent or Carrie or whomever for what's expected. And then last, most important is the gatekeeper, right? The gatekeeper, we talked about that, Guido being the gatekeeper for Antonio. The gatekeeper facilitates the person's penetration into the culture. They sanction him or her into that culture. That's what the gatekeeper does. So my dad bringing me into church was not only teaching me what I had to do, but he was my gatekeeper. We walked into church and everybody knew my dad and they liked him. And they would say, that's Sinbad. There's Sinbad. He's here. And there's his son. Look at him. He looks just like him. You know. And now I was not known to that culture, but Sinbad was. And so therein, our juxtaposition, really began to create this value rise for me in that culture. So the notion here is that to get Trent or James into something generic is not easy. It's much easier to put him in a Williams syndrome support group. This is not easy to do, but it's really essential because this man has so much to offer. Right? He'll change the world if he's allowed to be in the world, right? So what do we do, or what can we do to facilitate that? We can really think about this from a strategic point of view. So when we come back from lunch, that's exactly what we're going to do.